Welcome to Church Without Walls. I'm John, and this is
I'm Peyton.
Enthusiasm.
Yeah.
This is one of those Sundays where I'm at a loss for words, but I'm going to talk about saying goodbye to a loved one. After this. First of all, thank you to our friend Clark Van Gilder for recommending a device to show Peyton doing her digital art on her iPad without having to hold it up like a caveman to the camera. So if you look now, you could see Peyton is doing some digital art, and it's kind of my favorite picture of her and my father, which, there you could see, kind of bigger. So we'll probably finish that next week, as we have more to say about that. And when I hear atheists or anti-theists or even people of other faith talk about Christianity as if it's one cohesive whole, it makes me cringe as much as when I hear theists and people of faith talk about atheism as if it's like one argument or one cohesive whole. There are different shades of gray in both of these communities. And in some ways, I'm much closer to people of other faith or even to atheism than I am to some branches of Christianity, which I think distort the person of God into a monster. One of those branches, and trust me, I'm not going to beat up on Calvinism today, even though it is one of my favorite pastimes. But one of those branches is Calvinism and the determinism found in some corners of Christianity that suggests that God has micromanaged every molecule, and he's not only aware of the movement of every molecule, but he's predetermined it. And this has God becoming the tyrannical North Korean dictator of the Christians, right? This is the favorite God of the atheists because he's the easiest to attack because he isn't worthy of worship. And so oftentimes you'll hear Christians, though, who haven't really thought out that systematic theology, repeat things that are just simply either absurd or cruel or inconsiderate, ... One of those things is God, the idea that, there's a reason for everything, the 2-year-old who gets run over in the driveway. Well, there's ultimately a reason for that. God's using it either to teach you something or to bring something out of you. And boy, what a lesson that is. And, I just want to say that is, if you are somebody who's not a Christian and that's what's holding you back because somebody said that to you, or that's the kind of Christianity that you've been exposed to, I just want to say to you that makes me as uncomfortable as it makes you. That, to me, is not a God worthy of worship. That's a monster. And I stand with you in the rejection of that God. I, too, am an atheist, an unbeliever of that God. I want to say to you that, and I'm not a big defender of the Bible because the Bible is of different minds. It's got a lot of different authors who, argue and stretch different ideas and sometimes come to different conclusions. And that's what I was going to talk to you about this week, but circumstances have changed and just... Wendy said, just talk about this, and I guess I'm going to talk to you about this. But one of my favorite passages in Ecclesiastes is well known. It's been made into a rock and roll song, and for everything, it begins by saying, "For everything there is a season." So I believe Christianity actually is more in tune with the mind and the heart of God when it speaks in those terms. Not for everything there is a reason, but for everything there is a season. Now, I didn't prepare this for you. Maybe I should have, but this was a last minute change. So I'm just going to share a little bit of it with you. I know you've heard it, so this will be a repeat, but it's refreshing to hear a beautiful passage over again. For everything there is a season and a time for every activity under heaven, a time to give birth, and how joyous that is, and a time to die, and how filled with sorrow that may be, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard. See, that part is deconstruction there, a time to discard. So people who say deconstruction isn't biblical, sorry, it's right there. A time to tear apart and a time to mend. There you have deconstruction and reconstruction again. A time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. I love this passage. I quoted this passage upon my resignation at my church, announcing my resignation, because we were going to be uprooted there. But what makes that passage so valuable is I believe that it requires at least two things to make that passage work. And those two things are discernment and wisdom. Discernment and wisdom. And what do I mean by that? Well, noting what time it is very important in light of the behaviors that follow. In other words, if you're just told that somebody, a friend, has lost somebody dear to them, that's not the time to sing and dance, right? Somebody's getting married, you're at the wedding reception, that's the time you sing and dance. But there's also a time to be sorrowful and to mourn together, to sit shiva with somebody. And so what does it require? It requires a certain sense of decorum or discernment. And when we see people that don't have that, sometimes we'll throw out the metaphor that they're missing a filter of some kind. They just, they're misbehaving at a time. They're showing, the wrong emotion or the wrong feeling or the wrong behavior for what the occasion calls for, right? And you don't want to be able to do that. And to avoid that, you need discernment. You need a certain wisdom to be able to parse what's called for, what's required. So I like to think of death, and to be honest with you, why are we talking about this? For those of you who watch This Is Us, you've been blessed by 6 seasons of really well-written television, and this past week was the second to the last episode, and they depicted, and I'll try and do this without any spoilers for those of you who aren't caught up or for those of you who haven't watched it yet, but they're depicting the death or the passing of the matriarch of this family, which the story is built around. The story is built around Jack and Rebecca and their 3 kids, called the Big Three, and the travails and the joys and the triumphs and the sorrows that they go through over a lifetime. And this last episode, called The Train, was depicting the passing of Rebecca as she transitions from life to death. And they did it using the metaphor of a train. She's a passenger on a train, And she's meeting people on this train that she's met throughout life that have been meaningful to her. And they do this as she's starting to lose consciousness, as she's starting to transition to death. And well, I don't just bring this up to you because it happened on a television show this week, but it's actually happening in real time for my family as we say goodbye to my father, who's probably got hours, maybe days left. But this morning, Peyton and I and my wife talked via phone into Duke's ear, and he's unconscious right now, but we spoke into his ear, and we said our goodbyes. We said we love you, and told him how much he meant to us, and we said our goodbyes. And I told Wendy as we're having coffee this morning, I've got nothing. My tank is empty this morning. I've got nothing to say. She said, well, maybe you want to just talk about that. And to be honest with you, I don't. I don't. But I didn't want to leave you hanging this Sunday morning, so this is just talking from the lip as we normally do. I don't know if there's going to be anything useful here. I'm going to take a week to think about it, and I'm going to maybe bring a eulogy next week, if indeed my dad has passed by then. But so I'm not doing that right now. I just want to talk to you about some of the feelings that I think were depicted so well in that episode of This Is Us, because I think that might be what it's like as somebody's going in and out of consciousness. Do they hear the person in the room talking in their ear? Are they thinking back in time to some of the more inspirational moments of their life? I would think that's true. I would think that's probably accurate. Of course, we're only presuming this. But there is a season. This, for the Kirkwoods, has been a season of dying, and that's tough. We've had many great seasons of joy, of building, of picking up stones, or picking up sticks, laying down stones. This is our season of dying. We've lost our son, and now we're losing our patriarch, Duke, who's been so influential and impactful in our lives. I'll talk about that more like next week, but I just wanted to say that well, I'm so tired of death. I hope to talk about Christ to you in a few short weeks, but death is that megaphone that C.S. Lewis spoke of. He was saying, God whispers to us in our joy and speaks to us in our pleasure, but in our pain, it's God's megaphone to a deaf world. And now, have I gone back on, am I saying there's a reason for everything? No, I don't think that's what Lewis was saying, that there's a reason for everything. But I do understand at least this aspect of what he's saying. It certainly feels like you're being jolted, like you're being screamed at. There's one thing it does, and one of the things my father used to say is, when life takes a chunk out of you like this, when you go through pain, when you suffer, when you feel tragedy, when you're in deep sorrow, when you're in the anguish of the soul, you certainly separate the important from the unimportant. Now, maybe you haven't lived long enough to go through the loss of somebody really close to you yet, but let me just say this, and it's quite possible we have a younger audience today and you haven't lived through September 11th or a national tragedy, but those of you who lived through September 11th, who remember hearing it announced first on a radio, or maybe getting a phone call for somebody, or maybe the TV program you were watching was preempted to show what's going on in New York, you all kind of remember that day. to an older generation, it'll be when they heard about John F. Kennedy being shot. I remember I was homesick on the day that Ronald Reagan was shot. I wasn't in school, but I remember that day. I was homesick. I remember where I was when I heard it, and the how that set the tone in the house that day, how it just changed everything, how everything came to a stop and we sat in front of our TVs. This is what September 11th was like. I mean, there were things happening that day, but they all seemed to be happening as we were told by the motorcycle boy, and they were happening. The peripheral things were happening in black and white that day with the volume turned down. The only thing in color that day with Dolby sound was what was taking place in New York. And this is something that tragedy does in your life. When you're going through great anguish or sorrow or grief, everything else is muted. But it does help you separate the important from the unimportant. My mother used to always say, life is so precious and it's so short. And she used to try and get her children to separate the important from the unimportant. Don't get so worked up over things that are passing, over things that will rust or be blown away, like, tumbleweed. And she knew her family well. She knew we were very passionate. And when she saw us being passionate about lesser things, she'd try and draw us back to the gravitational pull of those things which are truly important in this world. And the ultimate importance that we find as human beings is in our relationships. And so Mary would constantly try to bring us back to realizing, as Mary would put it, love is the key that can open any locked door. Or as Pete Townsend would say, does my love open the door? In his words. And so one of the few things you can be grateful for when going through great pain is that you're less drawn or distracted by lesser things, by foolish things, by the headlines, by the last election or the next election, by, gas prices, by those things. It's not that you don't notice them. It's not that your head is in the sand. It's just that you realize these things are passing and I must be about my Father's business. What is my Father's business? For me, it's to communicate the love of Christ to those around me. It's to communicate that unconditional love for others that's really not based on anything other than the attitude of the lover. And so that's a full-time job. So many times I fail at that. So many times I allow little petty bumps in the road to distract me, to throw the alignment off of the car I'm traveling in. So if there's one thing I'm grateful to when it comes to grief or sorrow or pain, it's that it shakes you. It grabs you by the lapels and shakes you and says, "Wake up!" And well, Lord, I'm awake. Please don't shake me much more. I don't know that I can handle much more sorrow upon sorrow than what I've got right now. I know you're not steering planes into the ground and blowing candles out, but just expressing how I'm feeling right now. I'm going to cut to Poe real quick because this is looking really cool. Now she's painting herself in. That's really cool. I don't have much to offer you today. I just wanted to let you know that that phone call was really... something was really special about it this morning. I hope my dad heard what we were saying. Connor and I had a chance to visit him earlier in March, and we were able to say we love you. But it was nice to be able to have Wendy and Peyton be able to say it, even though we're at a great distance. Isn't that the wonder, one of the absolute joys of technology, that when you are separated by, 1,000 miles or great distance, you could still reach out and communicate love. Now, some of you were startled with the death of a loved one. I was talking to somebody yesterday who lost his father suddenly, and you get that call like I did about my son, where you don't have a chance to say goodbye, where you don't have that last opportunity to tell somebody that you love them and how deeply important they have been in your life and how much you'll miss them. And that's just kind of another stab in the heart for this kind of a relationship, for that kind of ending to a relationship. Or my relationship to my son hasn't ended, but to that change, that kind of extreme change in what our relationship is. I don't think we should dwell on that. Of course, it is a regret, maybe even a remorse. But one thing I tell my family about Carter is he knew he was loved by his brother deeply, and by his little sister, and certainly by his mother and his father. If there's one thing we've done right in this family, it's show unconditional love and support each other no matter what. And I've done a lot of things wrong. I'm not perfect, and far from it, but I think that's the one thing that we've gotten right in our house, is we've made our home a nest, and we don't have any conditions to the affection that we have for one another. We don't have a carrot and a stick, and so, but we move forward, and we become more tender of heart. We become, hopefully, better lovers. I don't believe in coincidence, and this morning there was a memory that was something I shared from 3 years ago, a passage by Susan Fribourg, who says, "They say that beauty comes from a spirit that has weathered many hardships in life and somehow continues with resilience. And there grace can be found in a soul who ages softly, even amidst the tempest. I think the loveliest by far is the one whose gentle heart bears 100 scars from caring, yet still finds a way to pick up the lamp one more time to light the way for love. I think the loveliest by far is the one whose gentle heart bears 100 scars from caring, yet still finds a way to pick up the lamp one more time to light the way for love." I think I'm going to leave you with that today, because I don't want to talk just for the sake of talking or filling up time. I hope I'm not short-shifting you, Poe. I'm going to flash to you in a second, and we're going
to... next week.
Yeah, you're going to finish this next week. One more view of what Poe's working on. I guess kind of a self-portrait of herself right now.
Well...
yeah, and what is one of my favorite paintings or pictures of my father with my daughter. I will say this. It may seem selfish, but my favorite picture of my mother is the one with her sitting on the couch with my 2 young sons, and she's reading to them. I have another favorite picture of my mother, and it's when she was standing next to her mother in Lincoln Park in Chicago. I've got a number of favorite pictures, but my favorite picture is the love she showed my sons on that couch. I was there to take that picture. I saw it happening, and she was so present in their lives. And the funny thing is, Wendy and I would go over there, and for a while we lived with them to help take care of my mother. But the moment we'd show up, if we had our kids with us, I know she loved me, and she loved me deeply, but it was all about them. It was all about, at the time, Connor and Carter. And she did enjoy Peyton for her last few months. I'm grateful for that. But maybe this picture of my father is my favorite of his, because he's looking tenderly on his grandchild, on Peyton, and I could just feel the love he has for her there. And I shared a quote from, I think it's from his 5th book, where he says, "One person is worth more than the whole earth to God, and ought to be so to each of us." Duke, I love you. Grateful for all you've done. More on that next week. Folks, thanks for listening. I hope I haven't wasted your time today. We'll see you next week.